On June 10, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 was on its way to Spain, when, without warning, 2 of the 6 cockpit windows exploded from their frames. Such an explosive decompression in the cockpit would usually lead to a deadly disaster, but, miraculously, the crew on board were able to bring the plane safely to the ground with no loss of life. Flight 5390 began as a fairly routine flight. Departing from Birmingham Airport, it would be flying to Malaga in Spain, a journey of just under 3 hours. Weather conditions were pleasant and clear. On board were 90 passengers and crew. After a routine takeoff, Captain Tim Lancaster activated the autopilot and undid his seatbelt, and made himself comfortable for the flight ahead. All was well, and then, quite suddenly, it wasn't. Without warning, 2 of the cockpit windows exploded outwards, leaving the cockpit open to the elements. The abrupt change in pressure was explosive, blasting the door between the cockpit and the main cabin of the aircraft off its hinges, and pulling Captain Lancaster out of his seat. Only his legs remained inside the cockpit, while the rest of him was pinned against the outside of the plane. The captain's feet were jammed against the controls, forcing the plane into a steep dive. Co-pilot Alistair Atchison struggles to gain control of the plane, without much luck. The explosion has let in thick fog and an incredibly noisy and powerful wind, making communication almost impossible. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden had just entered the cockpit. He lunged forward, grabbed Captain Lancaster's legs, and held on. With the help of the 2 other crew, he was able to free the captain's feet from the controls. First Officer Atchison was now able to gain control of the aircraft and requested clearance from air traffic control to land at the nearest airport, Southampton. An unfamiliar airport, but the only option if he wanted to get on the ground quickly. Despite the dire circumstances, he was able to land the plane safely, a remarkable feat considering his captain was hanging halfway outside the cockpit. Was he even still alive? Emergency services were on the scene to meet Flight 5390. Traumatized passengers were escorted out, while paramedics and cabin crew pulled Captain Lancaster back into the cockpit and administered first aid. He had been subjected to the cold, lack of oxygen, and fierce winds. He should be dead, but much to everyone's surprise, was still alive. He suffered several broken bones and frostbite, but within a few days he was answering press questions from his hospital bed. An investigation was launched to discover why the cockpit windows had blown out. One of the ejected windows was retrieved from a field in Oxfordshire, and both it and the aircraft were thoroughly inspected. The cause of the incident was readily apparent. The windows had been secured with the wrong bolts. The bolts were slightly shorter and thinner than required. The windows were installed the night before the incident, when engineers changed the panel during a routine maintenance procedure. The size difference meant that the bolts could not withstand the air pressure difference between the cabin and the air outside. How had this happened? Suspicion fell upon the worker who would replace the windshield. He was interviewed, and it was found that he had made several small but significant mistakes. Before conducting his maintenance, the windows were already fitted with the wrong bolts. Rather than checking the manual and discovering the mistake, he attempted to replace them like for like. And to make matters worse, nobody checked his work. In the aftermath, British Airways reviewed its maintenance practices. Every plane of a similar design was checked, and a handful had windshields secured with the wrong bolts. The crew of Flight 5390 received commendations for their bravery, and Captain Tim Lancaster returned to the skies just 5 months after the incident, and retired in 2008.